Hello and welcome to another edition of Market Watch. Today we are going to have a very interesting session on consumption or consumer spending. Consumption has become one of the major drivers in any given economy. The changes in the consumption pattern or rather consumer pattern may have a great impact to the economy as a whole, to the broad economy. So today's consumer is more value conscious, more interactive and health driven, at the same time highly connected. So the consumption pattern changes both locally and globally has a great impact on the broad economy. To discuss more in detail in this particular subject area, we invited the Managing Director of Sri Lanka, Mr. Sharan Pant, to our show.
Thank you.
Welcome to the show, Sharan. At the same time, glad to have you in our show today. Before we go into the consumption or rather our theme, let me first have your views on the macro or rather business sentiment of Sri Lanka today. What's your opinion, Sharan?
So Pasindu, in order to understand why Sri Lanka is behaving the way it is behaving now, I think we need to take a longer perspective. Let's talk about what happened in the last 4 or 5 years. Post-war, what growth we saw in terms of the economy or in terms of the disposable income for the consumer was driven by a few things. The economy picked up, the service sector picked up, the industry sector picked up, and the industry sector picked up largely on account of construction that happened in the country, whether it's infrastructure in the form of roads or the airport or a few other things. That is what drove the industry sector, that is what brought in the employment, and as a result, the disposable income went up. Now, what we need to understand is a sector like construction cannot sustain the economy for a long period of time. It is momentary. Once the roads, the ports, the airports are done, you're not going to have that employment forever. In order to sustain employment and growth, manufacturing needs to step in. More investment into manufacturing needs to be there, more manufacturing jobs need to be created, and which will have a sustained growth in personal income. This is something which is possibly missing in Sri Lanka. So we saw growth led by construction, but that investment in manufacturing was not up to the expectation, and therefore the income growth was also not sustained. As a result, what we see is the per capita income, which was growing significantly for Sri Lanka. In the last 2 or 3 years, it's remained stable. And in fact, in the year 2016, there was a marginal drop. So which is a little worrisome. So the government needs to look into its policies for attracting investment in FDI. Now, how does it impact consumption? The simple fact that Sri Lanka is still a largely import economy means that the prices of goods are a lot dictated by the value of the currency, how much of fuel we are bringing in, and the resultant inflation. Now, starting middle of 2016, what we saw is inflation started to move up. It was negative at the beginning of 2016, gradually started to move up starting about second half of 2016. Another reason why inflation moved up was Sri Lanka's electricity generation is largely hydroelectricity. With the drought that set in the second half of 2016, there wasn't enough water, and as a result, fuel had to be imported in. So more the fuel came in, more the currency got impacted, and inflation went up even higher. So we got in a situation wherein end of the year and early 2017, inflation moved up to about 8%. The food inflation moved up to about 13%, and the consumer's disposable income was impacted significantly. So we asked consumers, what will you do because of the changes in taxes? What will you do because of the increase in inflation? And what consumers mentioned to us is they will have to continue consumption of the necessity items. So I can't cut down on the cooking oil that I was consuming, maybe a little bit of cut down here and there, but not much. I cannot cut down on the amount of toothpaste I'm using or the amount of toilet soap I'm using. So that will have to continue irrespective of the price increase. But I have the limited amount of money. So where will I make a saving? I would then make a saving on some discretionary items. What are these discretionary items? In FMCG, it is the impulse food categories, so categories like biscuits, chocolates, soft drinks. In non-food categories, it's categories like skincare, deodorants, which I can do without. In non-FMCG categories, it's recreation, eating out, or going for a movie, or buying electronic items. I would postpone that. I would move that in order to manage my current expenses, and which is what consumers are doing. And what we saw as a result is FMCG growth came down significantly. Remember in Q1 2016, when the current government increased the salaries of government employees, there was a big jump in consumption because the consumers had additional income to play with. We saw almost 11% FMCG growth in that particular quarter. But that could not be sustained going forward because inflation was moving up. And in the first quarter of 2017, we saw growth coming down to just 1%. This is the real value growth that I'm talking about. The consumption, absolute consumption, in fact, went down. So compared to same quarter last year, there was a 3% decline in consumption, and which is what we saw again in Q2 of 2017 as well. So consumption has not yet picked up. Going back to business sentiments or consumer sentiments, so when we speak to business leaders every month in the form of our business confidence survey, they keep saying that inflation, interest rate, currency, these are the three things which are impacting ease of doing business. Yes, they talk about policies, which means foreign direct investment and opening up of different sectors, but the current issues which the country is facing, they talk about three things: interest, taxes, inflation. That has impacted their sentiments and it's been consistently coming down. Talking about consumers, I mentioned again the same thing: taxes going up on a few categories and inflation is impacting their sentiments as well. Now fortunately, in the last 1 or 2 months, we see some green shoots. There is stability which is coming in. Various reasons. There is more communication coming in from the government. The IMF and the World Bank, they are also acknowledging the efforts put in by the Sri Lankan government on fiscal discipline. So they are releasing their next tranche as such. At the same time, the government managed to get the GSP Plus approved. Now, how's that going to impact? Obviously, for businesses, it means new orders and more workforce coming in. More workforce means new job opportunities. New job opportunities means more disposable income. So it's impacting both business sentiment as well as consumer sentiment, and it's slightly on the upswing now. If we go by how the sentiments are right now, we'll possibly see a small revival by the end of the year, but definitely not to the extent that we saw early 2016. So that's the situation we are in. We are struggling over the last 4 or 5 quarters, but with a few good news coming in, we should be looking at some light at the end of the tunnel now.
Yeah, Sharon, I think it's good to hear that for sentiment has been gradually rather picking up in Sri Lankan context. And if I touch on the consumer spending in terms of the global outlook or other sentiment, what sort of changes or other developments which have been happening from the global front, Sharon?
Sure. I think there are 3 major trends which are emerging globally. So when we say globally, it's relevant more in some markets, relevant to a lesser extent in some markets, right? What are these 3 trends? The first one that we see is the world is increasingly urbanizing. More and more people are getting into the cities, moving away from the rural areas and moving into the cities in look for jobs or look for better opportunities. As of 2017, 55% of the global population resides in urban areas. This has increased by 5% points in the last 10 years. So it was around 45% in 2007. It's moved up, 50% in 2007, and it's moved up to 55 in 2017. A McKinsey report released in 2015 says that 600 major cities in the world will account for $30 trillion of global economy. That's a big number. Apart from this big quantum, what they also say is about 2/3 of the growth, or 65% of the GDP growth from the period 2005 to 2020 is being driven by these 600 cities. If you look at it, where these cities are, yes, still a large part of it is in the developed countries like the US, Canada, Europe and the Pacific. But a lot more cities are emerging in Asia and Africa as well. China, as you know, every 2 years there's a new city that emerges in China. That's a conscious effort put in by the government over there. Similarly, in Bangladesh, Indonesia, India, African countries, there are newer cities which are driving this kind of a growth and the urbanization model as such. It needs to be seen how we manage that in Sri Lanka as well, because as you are aware, though 85% of our population is in rural, this rural is more or less like semi-urban. You hardly find any difference between any rural area versus say a Colombo or a Kandy. So that's trend number one. The second trend is on aging. The world is growing old. We're not getting younger. With average birth rates coming down, average family size coming down, we are getting older. The median age globally is around 30 to 31 right now. Now compared to that, in Sri Lanka we are 33. So we are slightly older compared to the world. What it means now, as the world population ages, as of now it basically is saying that there's a larger population employed in the workforce. So therefore the income levels are increasing in different markets. It is driving consumption. But as the age increases further, moving towards say 45 or 50, it's a good situation that the world is currently in, because I'm saying that because there are employment opportunities even for those who are in their 50s right now. This was not the case maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years back. More and more people above 50 are still in the workforce, either as consultants or they are continuing on their own or continuing their employment as well. So again, newer consumption categories can emerge out of it. The third trend which is emerging is obviously digitalization. With the whole burst of internet in the developing market, more and more people are coming online. On an average, every week about 3.5 million people get onto the internet. If you look at the internet penetration in South Asia, Sri Lanka with about 30% is one of the highest in terms of penetration. Yes, there is scope for improvement. If we benchmark ourselves versus Southeast Asia, the penetration is slightly higher over there from Malaysia or Thailand or Singapore. Yes, Indonesia, Vietnam are at par or lower, but there are these other developed markets which are on the higher side. So these are the three trends which are emerging, which will change the way consumers consume or shoppers shop in the future.
From the consumer spending per se, have you seen any significant differences in economies across the world?
Yes, so the consumption spends or the share of wallet basically depends on the stage of development for that economy. So in Western economies where the development has already happened, the per capita is already high, you would see that the share of food and beverages, necessity items, is low. I mean, obviously their absolute consumption will be higher than anyone in India, China or so some other markets, but the share of their total spends is on the lower side. So to give an example closer to us, let's take Malaysia, which is an upper middle income economy. Over there, the share of food and beverage in monthly spends of any household is about 20%. Compared to that, Sri Lanka, which is a lower middle economy country, or Vietnam, which is also a lower middle economy country, share of food and beverage is 40%. So of our total spends in a month, in terms of share, we spend almost double on food and beverage compared to a Malaysian consumer. But as the growth will happen in income, there will be newer avenues of spends coming in, or you will spend more on other items. Once my basic necessities of housing and food and beverage is taken care of, then I would possibly think of spending more on communication. So my mobile spends will go up, my internet spends will go up. I'll possibly think of spending more on transport, maybe buy a better car, my fuel consumption goes up. Well, in Sri Lanka, that's not really an issue because I see more premium cars here than any other market. But yeah, typically that's the evolution that happens. You would also see spends going up on healthcare. Yeah, and it's also linked to the spends on insurance. In upper middle income countries, the insurance premiums or the penetration of insurance is much higher compared to market like ours. That's the kind of evolution that will happen, and that difference is already there in different parts of the world.
You said generally the world is, the aging population has been growing. But if you look at the new consumer or the young consumer, from that particular perspective, do you see any new developments, new trends or changes in the pattern, consumer pattern, etc.?
So I'm not a millennial, but I work with a lot of millennials around me, and I see that difference. A big change from when we were young versus what we see now is even the children have a larger say in how consumption happens in the house, and that's all driven by the knowledge that they are gathering over internet. So they are the ones who decide which brands come into the house. They are the ones who decide which category comes into the house. Similarly, when it comes to the early workers in the age of 20 to 25, their spends on internet, their spends on entertainment is substantially high compared to ours, because they don't really have to worry about a house. Their parents have probably managed that for them. So their areas of spends are much different from what we used to have.
Sharan, how these spending pattern changes affect the South Asian region, including Sri Lanka? How do you see the changes comes in?
Yeah, so as I said, there will be an evolution basis the increase in per capita. Now, if we just see the whole cycle, there would be the people at the lower end of the spectrum. We typically call them the survivors, yeah, because for them the per capita is much lower, so their needs are also very different. It's a survival need for them. Then comes the aspirers, who would look for quality. What do I mean by quality? So from unbranded, unpackaged products, they would move to branded and packaged. From the aspirers, the next step is the seekers. So I'm getting what I want, but I need something better now. I need convenience now. So in that terms, they would look for convenience. And what is driving this convenience? Things like e-commerce, things like eating out, or things like modern retailing. They would prefer these channels, they would prefer these outlets for their food consumption as well. And the last bit is the topmost class of the pyramid, the global elites. They are the highest income group. For them, it's all about customization. I'm not going to buy something which is there for the masses. I need something which suits my needs, which suits my likes. Now, this theory is common across the world, but how is it impacting South Asia? To answer your question, we've seen this happening in India, we've seen this happening in Bangladesh, and also to Sri Lanka. Yes, the extent differs for various reasons. I'll talk about that. But we are seeing the development of modern trade. We're seeing the development of e-commerce. E-commerce was pretty small in India a few years back. It's now picking up, and various reasons why it has picked up. Sri Lanka, with a internet penetration of 30%, a very good smartphone penetration, a literate population, there is no reason why e-commerce should not develop. I think the only reason why it's not yet developed, or a couple of reasons, is one is there is not enough investor money coming into that business model. So someone needs to invest for that business to grow. The second reason being the trust factor on electronic payment, whether it's to do with credit card payment or mobile payment. Yeah, there are some regulations which the government or the central bank also needs to look in, and then a consumer acceptance. So compared to a Bangladesh or India where it is picking up at a great pace, I think Sri Lanka on that front is slightly lagging behind. With some changes to the policy, it might have that impetus and the kickstart. The last piece which I mentioned on customization, I'm specifically talking about this point because customization leads to premiumization. So I would then opt for luxury goods which are offering me that customized benefits. Now in Sri Lanka, yes, some categories it's there. Again, going back to the automobile example, we invest into auto and don't consider it as an expense for some other reasons. But premium in other segments is still not to the level which is there in India. India per capita income is half of Sri Lanka, but still, let's take the example of FMCG products. In FMCG, premium accounts for about 30% of overall FMCG sales in India. In Sri Lanka, it is about 18%. So if you just look at the demography, it doesn't match, right? So why is it that premium is not picking up? Which is where the manufacturers or the brands can play a role, and also consumers can then upgrade. What I feel will help Sri Lanka is to graduate the consumers from where they are to premium by bringing in something called as affordable premium, a segment in between. So to give you an example, this is something which is now happening is in skincare, there are the local brands which are considered the mass brands, and then there are brands which are imported from outside. Local players as well as multinational players have now realized it, and they've launched a range in between. And the consumers are therefore upgrading first to that and probably then to the imported brands. So which is where Sri Lanka, as I said, is slightly behind its neighbors and definitely can move up that ladder as soon as possible.
Right. Within this context, what sort of emerging business opportunities that you can see?
Sure. So goes back to the 2 or 3 trends I mentioned. One is on digitization. So e-commerce is something that definitely can pick up. What I see for now is it's there in its nascent stages. It's relatively higher in the electronic durable spaces with takas.com or the other retailers coming in, but it can improve further. It will, as I said earlier, it will require some changes to the regulation, but once that comes in, e-commerce can definitely pick up. The second aspect could be on the insurance front. So from what I've seen in this market is insurance penetration is still on the lower side, and it's a result of consumers opting for other avenues of savings rather than thinking of insurance. Yeah, insurance is possibly thought about as protection against something eventual that may happen, rather than as an investment. So it will again require education from the service providers in order to get consumers to go for it.
I think we got good insights into how the consumption pattern has been changing, including Sri Lanka, across the globe. I think our investors should have got good insights as to how the new business development or business opportunities may come into play. So thank you so much, Sharat, for being with us. It was very informative thoughts. I think our investors should have got more insights into how the consumption pattern is going to be changed in the future. So thank you so much for being with us. Thank you so much for our viewers. See you next time with Market Watch.